The fluorescent lights in Roosevelt Elementary's cafeteria cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor as Officer Martinez stepped through the double doors, his radio crackling with static. 3 black children, none older than 10, sat frozen at their lunch table, plastic trays half empty before them. The youngest, a girl with bright purple hair ribbons, clutched a juice box so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of the kitchen refrigerators and the soft whisper of the officer's leather boots against the floor. "Which one of you took the extra sandwiches?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice cutting through the cafeteria's artificial calm. The children exchanged glances, confusion and fear dancing in their eyes. 8-year-old Jamal Washington shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his school-issued lunch tray containing exactly what he'd been given: a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. Nothing more, nothing less. 20 minutes earlier, the cafeteria had been alive with the usual lunchtime energy. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the head lunch coordinator, had been ladling soup into bowls with practiced efficiency when her assistant, Maria Santos, approached with the familiar green forms that marked the free lunch program participants. The federal program, designed to ensure no child went hungry, had been Roosevelt Elementary's lifeline for decades, serving nearly 60% of the student body. "Table 7 needs 3 meals," Maria had said, glancing toward where Jamal sat with his sister Keisha and their friend Marcus. All approved for the full program. Patricia nodded, assembling the trays with the same care she'd shown for 15 years, adding an extra cookie to each, because the shipment had come in over count, and she refused to let surplus food go to waste when children were involved. The trouble began when Karen Mitchell, a 42-year-old substitute teacher with perfectly styled blonde hair and a tendency to involve herself in situations that didn't concern her, noticed the cookies. She'd been hovering near the lunch line, ostensibly supervising, but her attention had fixated on the 3 black children with an intensity that made Patricia's skin crawl. Karen had been at Roosevelt for only 2 weeks, filling in for Mrs. Henderson, who was recovering from surgery. But she'd already made her presence known through a series of complaints about standards and proper procedures. "Excuse me, Patricia," Karen had said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of authority she'd never actually earned. "I don't think those children are supposed to have extra items. The program has specific guidelines." Patricia had looked up from her serving station, steam rising from the soup pot between them like a barrier. "Mrs. Mitchell, these children are getting exactly what they're entitled to. The cookies are surplus, and policy allows for—" "I know what I saw," Karen interrupted, her voice rising above the cafeteria noise. "That boy took 2 sandwiches. I watched him. This is theft, pure and simple." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone within earshot. Several children at nearby tables stopped eating, their young faces turning toward the commotion with the instinctive awareness that something was wrong. Patricia's hands stilled on the serving ladle. She'd worked in school nutrition for 15 years, had fed thousands of children, had navigated budget cuts and policy changes and the endless bureaucracy that came with federal programs. She'd never, not once, seen a child take more than they were given. The system didn't work that way. Children didn't serve themselves. They received pre-portioned meals from trained staff who knew exactly what each child was entitled to receive. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to step back and let me handle this," Patricia said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "There's been no theft. These children are eating exactly what they were served." But Karen had already turned away, her cell phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying across the cafeteria with unmistakable authority. "Yes, I need to report a theft in progress at Roosevelt Elementary School. 3 juvenile suspects, approximately 8 to 10 years old. The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. She abandoned her serving station, soup still steaming in the pot, and rushed toward Karen with a desperation that surprised her. "You cannot call the police on children for eating lunch. This is insane." But Karen had stepped away, moving toward the cafeteria windows where the reception was clearer, her voice rising as she provided the dispatcher with details that grew more distorted with each sentence. "The suspects are refusing to return the stolen items. They're being defiant. I need officers here immediately." The words echoed off the cafeteria walls, reaching the ears of children who suddenly found themselves unable to swallow their food. At table 7, Jamal had stopped eating entirely, his hand suspended halfway to his mouth, peanut butter sandwich forgotten. His sister Keisha reached across the table to touch his arm, her own meal untouched. "What's happening?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of confused voices. The cafeteria's atmosphere had shifted, the easy chatter of lunchtime replaced by an undercurrent of tension that even the youngest children could feel. Patricia rushed to their table, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and protective instinct. "Nothing's happening that concerns you three," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You keep eating your lunch. You've done nothing wrong." But even as she spoke, she could hear Karen's voice continuing in the background, painting a picture of theft and defiance that bore no resemblance to the reality of 3 children eating their federally provided meal. The police arrived within 12 minutes, their patrol car pulling up to the school's main entrance with lights flashing, but no sirens. Officer Martinez entered first, followed by his partner, Officer Johnson, both men carrying the weight of authority that came with their uniforms. They'd responded to the call as required, but neither had expected to find themselves investigating alleged theft in an elementary school cafeteria. Karen met them at the entrance, her voice breathless with the excitement of someone who believed she was doing important work. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. The situation is over there," she said, pointing toward table 7, where the 3 children sat in stunned silence. "I witnessed them taking extra food items. When I confronted them, they became belligerent." Officer Martinez surveyed the scene with professional skepticism. In his 8 years on the force, he'd responded to countless calls that turned out to be far less serious than initially reported. Something about this situation felt off, the pieces not quite fitting together in a way that made sense. 3 children, clearly frightened, sitting at a lunch table with what appeared to be standard school meal trays. "Ma'am, can you be more specific about what you observed?" Officer Johnson asked, his notepad ready. Karen launched into a detailed account that grew more elaborate with each sentence, describing a coordinated effort by the 3 children to overwhelm the lunch staff and steal multiple items. She spoke with the conviction of someone who'd witnessed a major crime, her voice carrying throughout the cafeteria. Meanwhile, Patricia had positioned herself between the officers and the children, her maternal instincts overriding any concern for her own position. "Officers, I'm the head lunch coordinator. I personally served these children their meals. There has been no theft, no extra items, nothing inappropriate. This is a complete misunderstanding." But the damage was already done. The presence of uniformed officers in the cafeteria had created an atmosphere of fear and confusion that spread through the room like ripples in a pond. Children at other tables had stopped eating, their young faces turned toward the drama unfolding at table 7. Some had begun to cry, frightened by the sight of police officers questioning their classmates. Officer Martinez approached the 3 children with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that his next words would matter. "We need to ask you some questions about your lunch," he said, his tone measured but official. Jamal looked up at him with eyes that held far too much fear for an 8-year-old. while Keisha gripped her juice box as if it might disappear if she let go. "We didn't take anything that wasn't ours," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Patricia gave us our lunch. We always get free lunch." The word free seemed to hang in the air, carrying with it the weight of stigma and shame that no child should have to bear. Marcus nodded in agreement, his own voice too frightened to form words. Karen watched the interaction with satisfaction, convinced that her swift action had prevented a more serious incident. "You see, they're admitting they took free food. But I saw them take extra items beyond what they were entitled to. That's theft, regardless of their age." Her voice carried across the cafeteria, ensuring that every child within earshot understood that accepting free lunch was somehow suspect, somehow deserving of police attention. The interrogation continued for several more minutes, with Officer Martinez trying to piece together a crime that didn't exist, while Officer Johnson documented details that would later prove embarrassing to read. The children answered each question with the honesty of youth, describing exactly what they'd been given and eaten, unaware that their very participation in the free lunch program had somehow made them suspects. It was then that Principal Janet Rodriguez burst through the cafeteria doors, her face flushed with the urgency of someone who'd run from the opposite end of the building. She'd been in a meeting with the district's curriculum coordinator when her secretary had rushed in with news that police were questioning students in the cafeteria. The words had hit her like a physical blow, and she'd abandoned her meeting without explanation. "What is happening here?" Principal Rodriguez demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd run Roosevelt Elementary for 12 years. "Why are there police officers questioning my students?" Her eyes swept the scene, taking in the frightened children, the defensive posture of the lunch staff, and Karen's self-satisfied expression. Karen stepped forward, eager to explain her actions to the principal. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I observed these 3 students stealing food from the lunch program. When I tried to address the situation, they became uncooperative. I felt it was necessary to involve law enforcement to ensure this behavior doesn't continue." Principal Rodriguez felt her blood pressure spike as the implications of Karen's words sank in. "You called the police on children for eating lunch." Her voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of everyone in the cafeteria. "These children are participants in the federal free lunch program. They're entitled to eat here. This is not theft. This is lunch." The confrontation between the principal and the substitute teacher played out in front of the assembled officers, children, and staff, each word carefully measured and loaded with meaning. Karen's confidence began to waver as she realized that her version of events wasn't being accepted as readily as she'd expected. "I saw what I saw. They took more than they were supposed to have." According to whom, Principal Rodriguez shot back. "Patricia Williams has been running this lunch program for 15 years. She knows exactly what each child is entitled to receive. If she gave them food, it's because they were supposed to have it." She turned to the officers, her voice shifting to a more diplomatic tone. "Officers, I apologize for this situation. There has been no crime committed here. These children were eating their rightfully provided meals." Officer Martinez looked between the principal and the substitute teacher, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "So, you're saying these children are authorized to receive free meals through a federal program?" When Principal Rodriguez nodded emphatically, he closed his notepad with a snap that echoed through the cafeteria. "Ma'am, it sounds like this was a misunderstanding. If the children were eating meals they were entitled to receive, there's no crime here." But the damage had been done. The 3 children at Table 7 had been subjected to police questioning for the crime of eating lunch while black and poor. Their classmates had witnessed the entire exchange. learning lessons about justice and fairness that would stay with them for years to come. The cafeteria, which should have been a place of nourishment and community, had become a courtroom where children were presumed guilty until proven innocent. As the officers prepared to leave, Karen made one final attempt to justify her actions. "I was trying to protect the integrity of the program. If children think they can take whatever they want, where does it end?" Her words fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence that she'd been wrong. But she pressed on with the determination of someone who'd never learned to admit error. Principal Rodriguez had heard enough. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to see you in my office immediately. Your assignment here is terminated, effective immediately." The words carried the finality of a judge's gavel, but Karen's eyes flashed with defiance rather than remorse. "You can't fire me for doing my job. I reported what I saw. If you choose to ignore theft, that's on you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Superintendent Dr. Michael Harrison, a tall man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in education. He'd been in his district office when the call came in about police activity at Roosevelt Elementary, and he'd driven over immediately to assess the situation. His face was grim as he surveyed the cafeteria, taking in the frightened children and the tense atmosphere. "Dr. Harrison," Principal Rodriguez said, relief evident in her voice. "I was just explaining to Mrs. Mitchell that her services are no longer required." The superintendent nodded, his eyes moving between the substitute teacher and the 3 children who were still sitting at table 7, their lunch trays now cold and forgotten. "Officers, thank you for responding," Dr. Harrison said, his tone professional but strained. "I want to assure you that this situation will be thoroughly investigated and that appropriate measures will be taken to ensure it never happens again." Officer Martinez nodded and prepared to leave, but not before approaching table 7 one more time. "Hey, kids," Officer Martinez said, his voice gentler now that the official investigation was over. "I'm sorry this happened to you. You did nothing wrong. Okay? You eat your lunch whenever you want. That's what it's there for." The words were meant to comfort, but they couldn't erase the trauma of being questioned by police for eating food they were entitled to receive. As the officers left the cafeteria, Karen gathered her belongings with the deliberate movements of someone who felt she'd been wronged. "You'll regret this," she told Principal Rodriguez. "When parents find out you're allowing theft in your school, they'll demand answers." But her threats fell on deaf ears as the principal focused on the more immediate task of comforting the affected children. The rest of the lunch period passed in subdued quiet, with Patricia Williams and her staff working overtime to restore some sense of normalcy to the cafeteria. They offered fresh meals to the 3 children, whose original lunches had grown cold during the interrogation, and made sure every child in the room understood that they were welcome and safe. But the story didn't end with Karen's departure from Roosevelt Elementary. Unknown to the participants, several cafeteria workers had been recording the incident on their phones, capturing not just the confrontation, but the fear in the children's eyes as they were questioned by police. The footage, shaky and incomplete, but devastatingly clear in its implications, would soon find its way to social media. By evening, the video had been shared thousands of times across various platforms, each share accompanied by outraged commentary about the criminalization of childhood hunger. The hashtag #JotchaLunchWhileBlack began trending, with parents, educators, and activists sharing their own stories of similar incidents and demanding accountability from the school district. The national media picked up the story within 24 hours, with reporters descending on Roosevelt Elementary to interview staff and district officials. Dr. Harrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how a substitute teacher had been allowed to call police on children for eating lunch. while trying to reassure parents that such incidents were not representative of the district's values. This was an isolated incident involving a temporary employee who grossly exceeded her authority. Dr. Harrison told reporters gathered in the school's main office, "We have immediately implemented new protocols to ensure that law enforcement is never again called to investigate children participating in our nutrition programs." The media attention brought both scrutiny and support to Roosevelt Elementary. Donations poured in from across the country to support the school's programs, while advocacy groups used the incident to highlight the broader issues of food insecurity and racial bias in educational settings. The three children at the center of the controversy became reluctant symbols of a systemic problem that extended far beyond their cafeteria table. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, found herself unemployed and facing public condemnation for her actions. The substitute teaching service that had placed her at Roosevelt Elementary terminated her contract, and her name became synonymous with the kind of racial profiling that many had hoped belonged to the past. She retreated from public view, but not before giving several interviews in which she maintained that she'd been right to report what she saw as suspicious behavior. "I don't see color," she told a local television reporter. "I see behavior, and what I saw was inappropriate behavior that needed to be addressed." The interview, which was intended to rehabilitate her image, instead provided more evidence of the deep-seated biases that had led to the incident in the first place. The school district, under pressure from parents and advocacy groups, implemented comprehensive changes to its policies and training programs. All staff members, including substitutes, were required to complete training on implicit bias and the appropriate handling of student disciplinary issues. The district also created a new position for a student advocate, whose sole responsibility was to ensure that incidents like the one at Roosevelt Elementary never happened again. Most importantly, the district established a new protocol that prohibited any staff member from calling law enforcement on students without first obtaining approval from the principal and conducting a thorough investigation. The policy was named the Roosevelt Protocol in honor of the three children who had been subjected to police questioning for eating lunch. 6 months later, Jamal Washington, his sister Keisha, and their friend Marcus were still students at Roosevelt Elementary, but they carried with them the memory of that day in the cafeteria. They'd received counseling and support from their teachers and the school psychologist. But the incident had left its mark on their young lives. They'd learned, far too early, that their very existence could be viewed as suspicious by some adults. Yet, the incident had also brought about positive changes that benefited not just them, but all students in the district. The free lunch program was expanded to include weekend meals and summer feeding programs, ensuring that no child went hungry when school was not in session. The cafeteria at Roosevelt Elementary was renovated with funds from the donations that had poured in after the incident, creating a more welcoming environment for all students. Principal Rodriguez, who had stood up for her students that day, became a district-wide advocate for student rights and social justice. She worked with community organizations to address the root causes of food insecurity and poverty that made programs like free lunch necessary in the first place. Her leadership during the crisis had earned her respect from parents, students, and colleagues alike. Patricia Williams, the lunch coordinator who had tried to protect the children from the beginning, was recognized with a state award for her dedication to student nutrition and advocacy. She used her platform to speak at conferences and workshops about the importance of treating all children with dignity and respect, regardless of their economic circumstances. The three children at the center of the controversy grew older and wiser, but they never forgot the day when eating lunch had made them suspects in their own school. They became advocates in their own right, speaking to younger students about standing up for what's right and supporting their classmates who might be different from them. The incident at Roosevelt Elementary became a case study in schools of education and law enforcement training programs, illustrating the dangers of implicit bias and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. It served as a reminder that the fight for justice and equality often begins with the smallest acts of courage and compassion. As the school year ended and summer break began, the cafeteria at Roosevelt Elementary was quiet once again. But the changes that had been implemented in response to that day would continue to protect students for years to come. The free lunch program continued to serve hundreds of children each day, and never again would a child be made to feel ashamed for accepting the nourishment they needed to learn and grow. The story of what happened at Roosevelt Elementary spread far beyond the walls of that school, inspiring educators, parents, and community leaders to examine their own practices and prejudices. It became a powerful reminder that protecting children requires constant vigilance, and that the cost of remaining silent in the face of injustice is always too high. In the end, the incident that had begun with such fear and confusion had become a catalyst for positive change, proving that even the darkest moments can lead to brighter outcomes when people of goodwill come together to do what's right. The 3 children who had been questioned for eating lunch had inadvertently become agents of change, their experience serving as a beacon of hope for a more just and equitable future. The legacy of that day would live on in the policies and practices that protected future generations of students, ensuring that never again would a child be made to feel like a criminal for accepting the basic human right of nourishment. In that way, the tragedy had been transformed into triumph, darkness into light, and fear into hope for a better tomorrow.